The marble gleams white under the morning sun. Monuments rise like promises carved in stone. The Capitol dome catches the light, signaling power, democracy, permanence. But walk these same streets at dawn, and you'll find something else. Lines of workers streaming toward buildings that weren't here 5 years ago, temporary structures thrown up in weeks, foundations still settling into swamp-turned park. This is Washington, D.C. in the 1940s, a city exploding. In less than 3 years, from 1940 to 1943, nearly 200 Zulzern people flooded into the nation's capital. They came for jobs that didn't exist in 1939, jobs created by the machinery of war. The population surged by 28%, 833 Zulzern souls crammed into a city designed for half that number. They slept in boarding houses, 20 to a brownstone. They rented corners of living rooms. They lived in alleys, in buildings without plumbing, without windows, in what locals called Hell's Bottom. Some never found a roof at all. This wasn't the dignified capital of civics textbooks. This was a boomtown, a gold rush without the gold, just government contracts, billions of dollars in war spending, and the frantic construction of the largest office building the world had ever seen. Built in 16 months on land seized from a black community. Built with sand dredged from the Potomac River because steel was reserved for tanks and warships. Built to coordinate a war that would reshape the entire planet. But here's what they don't tell you in the monuments and museums. Washington's transformation in the 1940s wasn't about democracy or freedom or the noble cause of defeating fascism. It was about something far more American, the marriage of government power and private profit. It was about who got to build, who got to live, where, who got paid, and who got left behind. It was about a city that became the nerve center of the largest military machine in human history, and the invisible workers, black women scrubbing floors, white secretaries crammed into stifling offices, construction crews working 3 shifts, who made it function. How does a swampy southern town become the command center of a global empire? And what does it reveal about the relationship between war, wealth, and the American promise of equality? If you enjoy in-depth investigations into major cities and empires across the United States, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where to explore next. Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Let's rewind to 1940. Europe is burning. Hitler's forces have swept through Poland, France, the Low Countries. Britain stands alone against the Nazi war machine. In Washington, President Franklin Roosevelt faces a problem. His military is scattered. The War Department, the civilian agency responsible for the Army, occupies 17 different buildings across Washington, Maryland, and Virginia. Key staff work from the Munitions Building, a temporary concrete structure erected during World War I on the National Mall. It was supposed to be torn down. Instead, it became permanent housing for a department that couldn't stop growing. By 1940, it's overcrowded, stifling in summer, impossible to coordinate from. Secretary of War Henry Stimson arrives in 1940 to find chaos. His staff is spread across the city like shrapnel. Some work in rented office space, others in decrepit tempos, temporary buildings from the last war, eyesores on the mall that were meant to last a year and lasted 2 decades. Meetings require car travel across town. Emergency coordination is a nightmare. The inefficiency is measured not in minutes, but in hours lost every single day. This is unacceptable for a nation preparing for war. The solution comes from Brigadier General Brand B. Somervell, head of the Army's Construction Division. Somervell is relentless. He's the kind of man who drives subordinates 7 days a week, regardless of weather. Between 1940 and 1941, his division built 50 major military camps and 28 troop reception centers, enough to house 1 million soldiers. Now, he turns his attention to the War Department itself. In July 1941, just 3 weeks after Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, Somervell presents his audacious plan. 1 building for 40 Großzügig workers. 4 million square feet of office space, the largest office building on Earth. The goal isn't just efficiency, it's consolidation of power. Every military branch, every administrative function, every contract officer and strategic planner under one roof. a fortress of bureaucracy. But there's a problem. A building this massive cannot fit in Washington, D.C. proper. The city has height restrictions, zoning laws, and most critically, no available land for something this colossal. So Somervell looks across the Potomac River to Arlington, Virginia. The site he chooses is called Arlington Farms, an asymmetrical piece of government land near Arlington National Cemetery. Because of its odd shape, roughly pentagonal, architect George Bergstrom designs a building to match. 5 sides, 5 concentric rings connected by spoke-like corridors. When President Roosevelt objects that the building will block the view from Arlington Cemetery, the site shifts slightly to Hell's Bottom, near the new Washington National Airport. The Pentagon shape stays. Roosevelt likes it. It recalls star forts from the age of gunpowder. It's distinctive, practical, impossible to redesign at this late stage. On July 28, 1941, Congress approves funding. On September 11, 1941, exactly 60 years before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, ground is broken on what will be known simply as the Pentagon. This is where the story of 1940s Washington truly begins. Not with democracy, with a military headquarters, with contracts, with fear. Construction moves at a pace that borders on reckless. The site is a swamp. Arlington Farm sits on low, marshy ground near the Potomac River. To stabilize it, workers truck in 5 million cubic yards of dirt. They drive 492 concrete piles into the earth to support the foundation. The building cannot be tall. Height is limited to 77 feet to preserve the view from Arlington Cemetery. So it sprawls outward, a massive 5-sided fortress consuming 67 acres. Because the United States is preparing for war, steel is rationed. Every pound of steel must go to tanks, warships, aircraft. So the Pentagon is built primarily of reinforced concrete. The concrete itself is made from 680,000 tons of sand and gravel, dredged directly from the bottom of the Potomac River. The exterior gets a thin limestone facade to make it look presentable, but more than half the building's mass is river sand. The construction contract goes to John McShane, Inc. of Philadelphia. McShane has already built the Jefferson Memorial, Washington National Airport, and the National Naval Medical Center in Bethesda. He knows how to work fast. He knows how to work cheap. And in 1941, speed is everything. The architects finish designs in just 2 weeks. Construction begins before planning is complete. Sometimes the builders outpace the designers. Walls go up before blueprints are finalized, leading to improvised material choices. 4,000 workers labor in 3 shifts around the clock. When Pearl Harbor is attacked on December 7, 1941, just 3 months into construction, urgency intensifies. The project becomes a national priority. The Pentagon is completed in 16 months. January 15, 1943. Total cost: $83 million. But the numbers don't capture the human cost. Think about the workers. 4,000 men, most earning daily wages, working 3 8-hour shifts. The day shift under blazing summer sun, the night shift in freezing winter cold. No OSHA regulations, no safety protocols we'd recognize today. Concrete dust in the lungs. Heavy machinery operated by men with minimal training. Accidents are inevitable, though rarely recorded. These men are invisible in the historical record. We know the architects, Bergstrom, his replacement, David Whitmer. We know the contractor, John McShane. We know the general who pushed it through, Brehon Somervell. But the men who poured the concrete, drove the piles, dredged the river sand, anonymous, expendable. And they weren't just building a headquarters. They were building roads. The Pentagon required an entirely new transportation network, access roads, parking lots for 700 cars, bus terminals, taxi stands. Building these roads destroyed the existing neighborhood. Queen City was a black community of 401 acres that had evolved after Freedmen's Village, a settlement for formerly enslaved people, was closed in the 1880s. Queen City lacked running water, sewers, electricity. But people owned their homes. They had built something. The Pentagon's road network erased it. Families were displaced. Homes bulldozed. The historical record is silent on where they went. Inside the building, the scale is almost incomprehensible. 5 floors above ground, 2 below, 5 concentric rings labeled A through E, 17.5 miles of corridors. But because of the spoke-like design, you can walk between any 2 points in approximately 7 minutes. 4,200 clocks, 284 restrooms, 7 cafeterias and snack bars, a central courtyard big enough to be its own plaza. This isn't just an office building. It's a self-contained city for war planners. By 1942, the first wing is complete, and the Secretary of War vacates the munitions building to move in. By early 1943, 32 Shu-0 workers occupy the Pentagon. They manage contracts for bombers, battleships, rifles, rations. They coordinate troop movements across 2 oceans. They process intelligence reports. They plan invasions. Every decision made in those concrete corridors translates to billions of dollars in war contracts. Contracts for Philadelphia shipyards, for Seattle aircraft factories, for Detroit tank manufacturers. The Pentagon is the beating heart of what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. But it's also the nerve center of the most lucrative government spending spree in American history. Between 1940 and 1945, the federal government will spend over $300 billion on the war effort, more than $4 trillion in today's dollars. Much of that spending is coordinated from this building, and all of it flows through Washington, D.C. While the Pentagon rises in Arlington, Washington, D.C. itself transforms into something unrecognizable. In April 1940, census takers record 153 residents in the district. This represents a 2% increase from 1930, faster growth than any state in the Union. Newspapers call it the New Deal boom. The Great Depression is ending. Government jobs are multiplying. The city is already straining. Then the war emergency hits. Between 1940 and 1945, the number of civilians employed by the federal government almost quadruples. By March 1943, the Census Bureau estimates Washington's population at 833,720, a 2% increase in just 3 years. But that official count understates the reality because it doesn't include military personnel stationed in the area or the constant churn of temporary workers passing through. The city processes 10 new arrivals every month. The Defense Housing Registry, created by the D.C. government, tries to match newcomers with available housing. It's an impossible task. Construction in Washington had slowed during the Great Depression. When war breaks out, materials and labor are diverted to military projects, bases, ships, the Pentagon itself. Housing construction for civilians essentially halts. The result is catastrophic overcrowding. Boarding houses that once housed a dozen people now pack in 50, 60, even 600 residents across multiple connected brownstones. Homeowners rent out spare bedrooms, living rooms, even hallway corners. The Washington Post reports families ringing doorbells during work hours, desperate to find vacancies because both husband and wife hold government jobs and nobody is home to answer during the day. For white workers, it's uncomfortable but manageable. For black workers, it's hell. Washington, D.C. is a segregated city, always has been. In the 1940s, segregation is enforced not just by custom, but by federal policy. The Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934 to address the housing shortage, explicitly refuses to insure mortgages in or near black neighborhoods. This practice, called redlining, ensures that black families cannot access home loans or move into white neighborhoods. When new public housing is built during the war, it's segregated by law. Projects like Ellen Wilson dwellings, completed in 1941 near Capitol Hill, are designated whites only. Black residents who lived in the area are forcibly removed to make room for construction. When the building opens, none are allowed back. The goal is to create larger white enclaves and push black residents further to the margins. Black workers arriving in D.C. for government jobs find themselves confined to overcrowded substandard housing. In the early 1940s, nearly 20,000 people live in Washington's alleys, narrow lanes behind main streets lined with hastily built and overcrowded alley dwellings. These structures lack running water, indoor toilets, proper ventilation. A study at the time finds that 74% of families living in these conditions are in deplorable situations. The majority are black. Washington has higher rates of tuberculosis and venereal disease than anywhere else in the country. Sanitation is a disaster. Overused, rickety outhouses leak sewage onto sidewalks. The water supply is contaminated. Officials overtreat it with chlorine, rendering it undrinkable. Congress is aware of the problem. In 1934, they created the Alley Dwelling Authority to address it. It does almost nothing. The alleys remain occupied throughout the war. Meanwhile, the new arrivals are disproportionately women. They're called government girls. Young, mostly white women from across the country who flood into Washington to take clerical jobs, typists, file clerks, telephone operators. The male workforce has been drafted or enlisted. Women fill the gap, and they outnumber available housing by an absurd margin. The Washington Post runs articles with barely concealed moral panic. Headlines warn about girls on the loose in a city full of men. Editorials blame the federal government for not properly supervising these young women, as if they're children who need chaperones. The reality is simpler. Thousands of women are living in overcrowded conditions, working long hours in stifling offices, trying to survive on clerical wages. Their work is essential. They process the paperwork that makes war possible. Every contract, every requisition order, every troop movement generates documents that must be typed, filed, cross-referenced. Without these government girls, the war machine grinds to a halt. But they're treated as a social problem, a housing problem, a moral problem. Hollywood cashes in on the chaos. Movies like The More the Merrier, 1943, Government Girl, 1944, and The Doe Girls, 1944, depict Washington's housing crunch as a charming romantic comedy. In these films, overcrowding leads to meet-cutes, misunderstandings, and eventual marriages. The reality, sewage in the streets, tuberculosis outbreaks, families sleeping in shifts, doesn't make it to the screen. The federal government tries to respond. Starting in 1942, they build temporary housing units. By war's end, about 400 units of temporary housing and 18 units of permanent housing are under construction. It's nowhere near enough. And much of the new housing suffers from catastrophic flaws. New construction in Alexandria, Virginia, is built without proper drainage systems. Sewage backs up into the main reservoir. Officials respond by over-chlorinating the water, making it too contaminated to drink safely. The problem persists for years. Nearly all new permanent housing is designated for white workers. Black workers are largely excluded. Only after sustained lobbying does the government set aside a small percentage of units for black families. Even then, those units are segregated, located in areas far from downtown, often inferior in quality. This isn't accidental. It's policy. Federal housing programs in the 1940s are explicitly designed to create and maintain racial segregation. The FHA refuses to ensure integrated developments. Builders who want federal backing must include racially restrictive covenants in their deeds, legal clauses that prohibit selling or renting to black families. Public housing authorities build separate projects for whites and blacks, ensuring they never share the same buildings or neighborhoods. The effect compounds over decades. White families who buy homes in the 1940s and 50s with FHA-backed loans build equity as property values rise. Black families denied those same loans remain renters or confined to redlined neighborhoods where property values stagnate. By the 1960s, the wealth gap is staggering. But in the 1940s, in the middle of the crisis, these policies are presented as practical, necessary, even benevolent. After all, the government is building housing. Isn't that enough? The answer, for tens of thousands of black workers, is no. By 1943, the transformation is complete. Washington, D.C. has become the administrative capital of a global war. Inside the Pentagon, 32 EOR workers coordinate military operations across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. They manage supply chains that stretch from Detroit to Guadalcanal. They process intelligence from occupied territories. They draft battle plans, and they award contracts. The scale of spending is unprecedented. Between 1940 and 1945, the U.S. government contracts for $50 billion in lend-lease aid to allied nations. Billions more go to domestic manufacturers. In Washington state alone, airplane and ship contracts in 1943-1944 are valued at 3 times the total of all manufacturing in the state in 1939. Seattle ranks as one of the top 3 cities in the nation for war contracts per capita. The contracts create fortunes. Companies like Boeing, Douglas Aircraft, and Bethlehem Steel become industrial giants. Shipyards in Philadelphia, Seattle, and San Francisco operate 3 shifts. Factories in Detroit retool from cars to tanks. Every contract is negotiated, approved, and managed by bureaucrats in Washington. And those bureaucrats have power. Consider the social hierarchy. At the top, military brass, cabinet officials, senior bureaucrats who manage billion-dollar budgets. They live in Georgetown in townhouses with servants and private gardens. They attend cocktail parties where defense contractors mingle with senators. They shape policy over dinner. Below them, mid-level managers, contract officers, policy analysts. They live in newly built suburbs in Maryland and Virginia, commuting by car to offices in Foggy Bottom or the Pentagon. Their work is technical, administrative, essential. They process the paperwork that translates political decisions into logistical reality. And at the bottom, the invisible workers. Black janitors who sweep the Pentagon's 17 miles of corridors. White secretaries who type contracts until their fingers cramp. Cafeteria workers who serve meals to 32 people a day. Telephone operators who manage 200,000 daily calls on 100,000 miles of cable. Mailroom clerks who sort documents through pneumatic tube systems, handling more top-secret information than the Defense Department's early computer networks ever will. These workers make the machine function. Without them, the Pentagon is just concrete and sand. But they're paid subsistence wages. They live in overcrowded housing. They have no job security. When the war ends, most will be dismissed without ceremony. But for now, in 1943 and 1944, Washington hums with purpose. The rituals of power are everywhere. Every morning, thousands of workers stream through the Pentagon's entrances, past armed guards, into the labyrinth of corridors. They navigate by ring letters and corridor numbers. A ring, E ring, corridor 4. They learn to walk the 7-minute routes between offices. They eat in segregated cafeterias. Officers separate from enlisted, whites separate from blacks. Downtown along Constitution Avenue, the munitions building still operates, now housing Navy personnel. The massive concrete structure, 841,000 square feet, 9 wings, won't be demolished until 1970. For now, it's a reminder of the previous war, the previous emergency, the previous promises. The new War Department building in Foggy Bottom, completed in 1941 and intended to house the War Department, instead becomes the State Department's headquarters. The building was already obsolete before it opened, a testament to how quickly the government outgrew its own projections. Across the city, temporary buildings sprout like mushrooms. They line the National Mall. They fill vacant lots. They're supposed to be temporary, but many will stand for decades. They're ugly, functional, despised by preservationists. But they house the bureaucrats who manage the largest military-industrial complex in human history. And the money keeps flowing. War production reaches its peak in 1944. Factories churn out bombers, battleships, rifles, ammunition, jeeps, rations, uniforms. Supply lines stretch across oceans. The logistics are staggering, coordinating thousands of ships, millions of tons of cargo, hundreds of thousands of troops, all of it managed from Washington. The city becomes a symbol of American power, of industrial might, of democracy defending itself against tyranny. Roosevelt frames it this way: the arsenal of democracy fighting for freedom. But there's another story beneath the rhetoric. This is also a story of profit. Defense contractors make billions. Political connections determine who gets contracts. Corruption is endemic, but rarely prosecuted. After all, we're at war. Efficiency matters more than ethics. It's a story of segregation. Black workers build the Pentagon, clean its floors, serve its meals, then go home to alley dwellings without plumbing. It's a story of gender. Women do essential clerical work but face moral panic and housing discrimination. It's a story of displacement. Entire communities like Queen City erased to make room for the machinery of war. And it's a story of power consolidated. The Pentagon isn't just a headquarters, it's a monument to centralized authority, to the idea that all decisions, all strategy, all coordination should flow through one massive building controlled by the federal government. This is Washington in its golden years. Not golden because it's prosperous for everyone, it's not. Golden because it's at the center of history, because every major decision about the war effort passes through these buildings, these offices, these corridors. But golden years always end. The war ends in 1945. The troops come home, the factories retool, the temporary housing empties out, or at least some of it does. Washington, D.C.'s population peaks in 1950 at around 800,000, then declines as suburbanization accelerates. White middle-class families move to Maryland and Virginia, buying homes with FHA-backed mortgages. Highways make commuting easy. The city's core begins to hollow out. But the federal government never shrinks. The Pentagon remains. The State Department stays in Foggy Bottom. The bureaucracy metastasizes. New departments are created. The Department of Defense, 1949, replacing the War Department. The CIA, 1947. The National Security Council, 1947. The Cold War requires a permanent wartime footing. The machinery of war becomes the machinery of peacetime. Today, Washington, D.C. is one of the wealthiest metropolitan areas in the United States. The median household income in the D.C. metro area exceeds $100. Arlington, Virginia, where the Pentagon sits, has a median household income over $120. Foggy Bottom, once a neighborhood of factories and pawn shops, is now among the most expensive real estate in the country. Georgetown townhouses sell for millions. The city's economy runs on government contracts. Defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, General Dynamics, maintain headquarters or major offices in the D.C. suburbs. They employ thousands. They bid on Pentagon contracts worth billions. The revolving door between military leadership and defense industry jobs is well-oiled. Generals retire and become consultants. Bureaucrats leave government to lobby former colleagues. This is the Beltway, the ecosystem of government, contractors, lobbyists, and think tanks that encircles Washington. It's insular, self-perpetuating, enormously profitable for those inside it. But the inequality persists. Washington, D.C., has one of the highest income disparities of any major American city. Wealthy neighborhoods west of Rock Creek Park, Georgetown, Cleveland Park, Chevy Chase, are overwhelmingly white, affluent, politically connected. Neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River are overwhelmingly black, lower income, politically marginalized. This divide isn't accidental. It's the legacy of 1940s housing policy, redlining, segregated public housing, FHA discrimination. The wealth gap created in that decade compounds over generations. The Pentagon still stands, now surrounded by 200 acres of manicured lawn. It's been renovated, modernized, fortified after the 9/11 attacks. It remains the world's largest office building. Over 23,000 people work there, managing a Defense Department budget that exceeds $800 billion annually. That's more than the next 10 countries combined. The contracts still flow. The revolving door still spins. The power still concentrates. Washington today is a monument to what was built in the 1940s. A centralized military bureaucratic apparatus that never demobilized. A city that transformed from sleepy southern town to nerve center of empire in less than a decade. A model of public-private partnership, if partnership means the government spends and private corporations profit. And beneath it all, the same pattern holds. Invisible labor keeps the machine running. Janitors, cafeteria workers, security guards, Clerical staff. Many are black. Many are immigrants. Most are paid low wages with few benefits. The buildings change. The technology advances. But the structure remains. So what does Washington, D.C. in the 1940s tell us about the United States? It tells us that crises create opportunities for those positioned to seize them. The war emergency justified rapid, massive government spending, but that spending didn't flow evenly. Defense contractors got rich. White workers got jobs and housing. Black workers got segregated into the margins. It tells us that power centralizes. The Pentagon wasn't just efficient, it was symbolic. One building, one command structure, one bureaucracy managing a global war. After 1945, that centralization never reversed. The national security state, born in World War II, became permanent. It tells us that segregation was policy, not accident. Federal agencies explicitly designed housing programs to separate races and exclude black families from wealth-building opportunities. This wasn't Southern racism overriding enlightened Northern values. This was Washington, the capital itself, codifying discrimination into law. It tells us that labor is invisible until it's scarce. During the war, government girls were celebrated, for a moment. Then the war ended, men came home, and women were expected to return to domestic roles. The black workers who built the Pentagon, never celebrated at all, erased from the narrative. It tells us that America worships efficiency and scale. The largest office building in the world. 16 months from groundbreaking to completion. 4,000 workers laboring around the clock. The numbers are staggering, impressive, meant to inspire awe. But they obscure the human cost, displacement, overcrowding, exploitation. And it tells us that money and power are inseparable in American life. Washington in the 1940s became the capital of an empire because it became the capital of contracts. Billions of dollars in war spending flowed through Pentagon offices, through contract negotiators, through bureaucratic channels. That money created fortunes. It built suburbs. It funded the rise of a military-industrial complex that, as President Eisenhower warned in 1961, would come to dominate American political life. But here's the uncomfortable truth. For many Americans, this system works. The suburbs built with FHA loans in the 1940s and 50s became engines of middle-class wealth. White families who bought homes for twice the national median income in 1950 saw those homes appreciate 10, 20, 50 times over. That equity-funded retirements, college educations, business ventures. Black families excluded from those same programs gained none of that wealth. Today, the average black family has about 5% of the wealth of the average white family. Not because black Americans earn proportionally less. Income ratios are around 60%. But because wealth compounds and the head start matters. Washington, D.C. is a monument to that head start. Walk through Georgetown today, past the multi-million-dollar townhouses, and you're walking through the accumulated wealth of government proximity. Walk through Anacostia, past the public housing projects and corner stores, and you're walking through the legacy of exclusion. Both neighborhoods were shaped by decisions made in the 1940s. Both are quintessentially American. The Pentagon still rises on the Virginia side of the Potomac. 5-sided, squat, unmistakable. 17.5 miles of corridors. 4,200 clocks. 284 restrooms. A building so large you can walk for 7 minutes and still be inside. Across the river, the monuments gleam. The Capitol dome catches the light. The Smithsonian museums line the mall, where temporary buildings once stood. Washington has been cleaned up, beautified, restored to the vision of the Macmillan Plan. The alleys are gone. The boarding houses are condos. The segregation is de facto now, not de jure, polite, invisible, encoded in property values and school district boundaries. But the machine built in the 1940s still hums, the defense budget still grows, the contracts still flow, the beltway still spins. And every year, new arrivals flood into Washington, chasing government jobs, contractor positions, lobbying gigs. The housing shortage has been replaced by a housing crisis of affordability. Young professionals paying $2 for a studio apartment, priced out by lawyers and consultants. The names change. The technology advances. But the structure holds. This is the city built on war contracts and fear. A city that discovered it could profit from emergency. A city that centralized power and never let go. A city that promised equality while codifying segregation. A city that celebrates monuments to democracy while the Pentagon, concrete, functional, vast, quietly manages the business of empire. And if you want to understand America, you need to understand this. Washington's transformation in the 1940s wasn't an aberration. It was a blueprint. If you want to see more stories like this, like the video, subscribe to the Forgotten America Stories channel. And tell us in the comments which millionaire town or abandoned empire I should explore next.